Hello and welcome back to the PSD to HTML flat design build. In our last video we got the navigation for our feature slider in place. We've got our left and right arrows as well as our four navigation icons down here in the bottom left, which right now it's kind of hard to see them because they're covering up this image, but we'll take care of that. In this video we're going to get started styling the content of our slider. So we're going to focus on, again, one slide within this slider. We're not going to build out multiple slides. We're just going to build out the basic design of a single slide. And so we have this text section here, which is going to be kind of a left column, and then our image right here is going to be in the right half of our slider. And if we look at our Photoshop file, we can see what that's going to look like. Again, in our left column here, we have our web design services, a little paragraph, and our click here button. And then in the right, we have our image. So let's jump into TextMate or whatever text editor you're using. And I've got main.css opened up, and everything that we save here, all the changes we make here will be saved in the Site 16 folder. And if you scroll down to the slider section, first of all, let's actually go to the HTML page. If we scroll down a little bit to the main content, then our feature slider, just inside the opening div for our feature slider, which contains the entire slider, we have two anchor tags for our left and right nav buttons, and then an unordered list for our navigation icons at the bottom left, and then after that we have a div with a class of slide. So all of the content we need for a single slide within this slider is going to be contained within this particular div. And then just inside that div, we have a div with a class of slide text. That slide text div has our H2 with the title, and then it has the paragraph, and then the anchor tag with our click here to learn more text in it. And again, we're going to turn that anchor tag or that link into a button using CSS. Then just after that, we have our image with a class of slide image, and that's pointing to that portfolio.jpg file. The first thing I want to take care of is the image itself. I want to move it off to the right so that we can see our text a little bit better. So I'm going to jump into main.css and then come down to the slider section, and we'll scroll down towards the bottom. And we gave our image a class, if you remember, of slide-image. So that's the class we're going to be editing here in our CSS. And for the slide image, I want to set the position to absolute so that we can set it wherever we need it. And then we'll just set the bottom and right properties. For the bottom property, we want it attached to the very bottom of the slider. So we're going to set our bottom property to 0 pixels. And then for our right value, you can either eyeball it and experiment with values or go into your Photoshop file and actually measure how far from the right edge of your picture is. And the value we're going to use here is 90 pixels. So it will be 90 pixels from the right edge of that feature slider. So let's save that CSS file, jump into Chrome, and refresh our page. And now we can see our image is in a better spot. And now that that image is out of the way, we can see a slight problem with our navigation items down here in the bottom left. If you remember, we set these navigation items 10 pixels from the left edge of the screen and 10 pixels from the bottom edge, not the screen itself, but of this slider. So it should be 10 pixels from the left edge of the slider and 10 pixels from the bottom of the slider, but as we can see, it looks like it's a little more than 10 pixels from the bottom of the slider. And one way we can kind of experiment with this if you're using Chrome is we can right click on one of those navigation items and click on Inspect Element, and we can take a look there and take a look at all of the elements surrounding it to see where this extra space is coming from. And if we click on the UL tag with a class of slider nav, you'll see some orange space to the top and bottom of that item. And if we come over here to our styles and scroll down to the bottom, we can see some extra margins on the top and bottom there. And that extra margin could be what's causing this issue. So if we jump into our TextMate or text editor, whatever text editor you're using, and then let's go up to our slider nav class, which is the class given to that unordered list itself. And then we'll just add a margin property here and set it to 0 pixels. Then we'll save that, jump back into our browser. Let's close our element inspector there, and then let's refresh our page with Command R or Control R if you're using a PC, and there we go. That got rid of that extra margin, and now our navigation items are where we want them to be. So now let's focus on the text here. Right now the text is flowing behind the image and all the way over here to the right, which is obviously not what we want. So let's jump into our CSS and let's edit that. So we'll go back to TextMate here, and I'm going to scroll down to the bottom just under slide image, and I'm going to skip a couple lines. And if you remember, the div with our text in it has a class of slide text. So we're going to create a rule for .slide-text. And then inside the curly brackets there, we'll enter a few values here. First of all, the width that we're going to deal with here is 310 pixels. I want that text area to be 310 pixels wide. So let's go ahead and save that. We have some more that we need to do with it, but let's save it and take a look at it for now. Let's refresh our page. And now we can see that it is a lot less wide than it used to be. So it's stopping right here, but now we need to nudge it over. We need to put some left margin on it, as well as some top margin so that it's not right up against the top edge of that feature slider. So let's jump back into our code and let's add a margin property. And for the top margin, we're going to use a value of 40 pixels. And then for the right margin, we'll use 0. For the bottom margin, we'll use 0. And for the left margin, we'll set it to 90 pixels. So it will be 90 pixels from the left edge of the feature slider. Just like our image up here was 90 pixels from the right edge. So let's save that and refresh our page. And there we go. Our text is aligned a little bit better. Now it's still, you'll notice the text itself is right up here against the top edge of that slider. And now there's more space in between the slider and the unordered list or the navigation menu above it. Well, one thing I'm going to do to fix that is for the slide text div, I'm also going to set it to float to the left. Save that, refresh our page. And now that it's floating to the left, you'll see that that top margin is now working within this particular slider. So now we're a lot closer to where we need to be. Also, you'll notice that the feature slider is right up against the edge or the bottom edge of our main menu, and we need to fix that. We need to put 4 pixels of spacing in between the two items, but we'll get to that in a moment. First of all, let's fix the text here. If we go back to our Photoshop file, you'll notice we're not using the Acme font for the H2 tag here for the Web Design Services text. Instead, we're using the Symphony font. So we need to change that. We also need to change the color to orange. So let's go back to our code, our CSS file, and let's point to the H2 tag within that slide text div. So .slide-text space H2. So for this H2, we're going to give our text a color of pound F26C4E. And that will turn it orange, the same orange color we used for our background of our home button, as well as some other items. And then I also want to give that H2, you'll notice there's a lot of space in between the H2 and the text below it. So I want to give that bottom margin. So we'll set the margin bottom property, and we're going to set that to 0. We're going to get rid of that bottom margin. So let's save that, refresh our page. And there we go. That gets rid of a little bit of the space in between. Now there's still some top and bottom margin on the paragraph, but that's okay. We've reduced some of that space ever so slightly, and that looks pretty good. So now I want to change the text, the font for that header text. So let's jump back over here into the rule for our slide text H2, and we need to change the font family there. So let's scroll back up to the top where we have our font family declarations, and we want to grab this one right here with the Symphony font. So let's grab that, copy it, and scroll back down to the bottom inside our H2, and we'll just insert or paste that font family property there where we have Symphony. And let's save that and refresh our page. And there we go. We're getting a little bit closer. Now I want to go ahead and style the click here button. So right now this is just a link. I want to turn it into a button, which is really just a link with a fancy background and some padding around the edges. We already have a background color applied to it. We just need to add some padding. We're going to round the corners a little bit, and we're going to change the text. So let's jump back into our code. And if we look in our HTML file, inside the slide text div, here's our anchor tag, and we gave it a class of btn for button. Now there might be other parts of your site where you want to use an anchor tag as a button, so we want to set this up kind of generically. We don't want to set up a CSS class for a button that only applies to this specific button. We want to create a pretty generic class. So we're going to put it in a different section. We're not going to put it in the slider section. And again, we've already given it a class of BG orange, which gives it that orange background color. But now we're going to focus on this BTN class. So let's jump back into our CSS file. And I'm going to scroll up towards the top just before we get to all of these different sections here. And here's all of our BG classes here. And just after all of those BG classes, we're going to create a rule for our BTN or button class. And for that button class, I want to do a few things. First of all, I want to set the border to none. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to apply this button class to the button element as well. And sometimes the button element in certain browsers has a default border around it. So we're going to use this to get rid of that default border. We're also going to set it up as an inline block element, because remember, an anchor tag is an inline element and you can't set the width and height of an inline element. So just to make this more flexible, we're just going to give it a display of inline-block. I'm also going to set some padding. I'm going to set some top and bottom padding of 10 pixels and some left and right padding of 20 pixels. And that should stretch it out a little bit. And if we save our CSS file and take a look at that in Chrome, we can see what that looks like. So that gives us a little bit more room around the text, and so far it's looking pretty good. So let's jump back into our code for our button class. And for our buttons, I'm going to set our default color to $FFF, which is white. And you might create some buttons later on that have a light colored background where you need to use a different text color. And if that's the case, then you can just go into that specific button and override this text color. But for the most part, we're going to be using dark backgrounds, and a white text over that button is going to work really well. Also, for the default button, I want to set the font size to 18 pixels. And I want to get rid of the underline text. Since it is a link, that text is underlined by default. So we're just going to set text decoration to none to get rid of that underline. And then I want to round the corners a little bit. So I'm going to set border radius to 4 pixels. So let's save that, refresh our page, and there we go. That looks a lot better. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very similar hover effect to the one we've created before, where when we hover over it, it's going to transition to a lighter shade of the same color. So let's go back into our code, and we need to create a transition property. But first, let's go ahead and copy this border radius and paste it 3 times. And then we'll add some vendor prefixes here for Mozilla, WebKit, and Opera. And then we'll create our transition property. Now our transition property, we've already created one up here, so we can just copy all of this. And since we're just transitioning the background color anyway, instead of typing it in again inside the button class, let's just add the button class to this list right here, because this list of classes here, the only thing we're doing to that list is creating a transition for the background color. And that's all we need to do for the button property as well. So we can just come over here after our main nav BG blue and type comma space dot btn. So we've just added the button class to this list. Then we need to add the hover color to the button class. So for a button with a background of orange, we want to use this background color here that we used for the background of orange in our main nav. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to add another class to this rule right here. So we have main nav BG orange :hover, comma, then we'll just go to the next line here and type .btn .bg orange :hover. So we're also applying this background color to the hover effect of a button that also has a class of BG orange. So we're looking for something that has a class of button and BG orange applied to it. Notice there's no space between the dot button and the .bg orange because these two classes, are both applied to the same item. So we can also do the same thing for the rest of these items with a background color. But I'm not creating any buttons right now with other background colors, so we'll just leave it as is for now. Let's save that, jump back into Chrome, refresh our page, and then test it out. And we see that our hover effect works just fine. So that takes care of the content for our feature slider. Now before we move on, let's go ahead and add 4 pixels of space between our unordered list and our feature slider here. So we'll just jump back into our code. We'll find down here close to the bottom, we'll find our feature slider div here. and we'll just add 10 pixels of top margin here. So margin top, 10 pixels, save that. I'm sorry, not 10 pixels. Let's go back and make that 4 pixels. Save it, refresh our page, and there we go. Now we have 4 pixels of space there. And that looks really good. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.